Hello again in Jakarta. I hope everybody is well and that you enjoyed the teaching last week. This week we will be here online only on video, and I have prepared a little presentation that I hope will be helpful for you. It's first time I try this, so this is very new to me, but let's see how it turns out. If we should look a little on the program for this lecture, and which is, I'm trying to make it a one take, 45 minutes. You need to take the breaks on your own, under your way. I hope it's okay this way. It might be a little long, and I apologize, but I didn't have so much time to prepare that I could make a bigger thing. We will talk about shutter speed today, creative use of shutter speed, but also some basics behind shutter speed, some tools to consider when we work with especially slower shutter speed, but also some with fast shutter speeds. We will talk some about daytime photography and nighttime photography, where the settings in the shutter speed are important. And I've tried to include some of my own pictures also. This picture here is from yesterday evening, where I visited together with my wife the Tivoli Garden in Copenhagen, which is dressed up for Christmas presently, which means lots of lights here in Denmark, where the winter time is very dark. It gets dark here at, when we get in the middle of December, it will be like dark at 3:30, and then the sun will rise again at 9:30-ish. So we have some very long nights, and we are prolonging them by having lots of light in our environment. And Tivoli Garden is probably the place in Denmark where you have most of it. So let's start with some basics. I guess you have heard about the exposure triangle, or some call it the light triangle, where we have on the one side the aperture, where if we open our aperture, where we have the small numbers, we will have a shallow depth of field, and the more we close our aperture, the larger depth of field we get. You could see there's also this arrow going from darker to brighter. Then there is this side of the triangle, which is with the ISO, or the sensor sensitivity. ISO, that goes back from the good old film days, where we shot on film, and there were different kinds of films, and we usually shot on like ISO 50, when it was very, very little light sensitive, so that was for really sunshiny days, and then 100 was more the normal setting, and then we could buy 400, and then it started getting grainy, and the most light sensible film normal people could buy was 1600 ISO, and this was then you really got grainy photographs, and we still do with even though we have electronic shutters. But that's not the topic for today. The topic for today is, of course, um, shutter speed. And again, we have this arrow from darker to brighter, just as we have here with the ISO. But we also have this from long shutter speeds with low numbers behind the divider, to very short shutter speeds. And we have this from motion blur to less motion blur here. So when we change something at one side of the light triangle, we probably might have to change at least one more parameter. So if I, for example, if we have the right exposure set and we change something here in the shutter speed, well, then we either have to change the ISO or the aperture. So this is also always this balance we have to find as photographers to work with that. And we do that in our cameras, on our cameras, typically here on this knob. Looks different from different brands, but probably also the same. This Nikon has these manual aperture, speed, and program, and total auto. Here in this Canon or Sony, they go with P and TV, which is time or shutter speed, and AV is aperture, and M again is manual. And here we have the same. Maybe I found two Canon cameras. I was searching for a Sony, but we will probably figure out quite fast working with the cameras what is what. I actually have, this is a photo of my former camera, and I very often use the aperture program, but I have a mirrorless where you can program also the ring on your lens to have exposure composition, so you can work with different elements of with your camera. But when I do flash photography, it's always on manual, so it depends very much on which kind of things I work with and how fast I need to get the exposure right. A little more basics. That has to do with the you could just say the focal length versus shutter speed rule of thumb, which means that the focal length is important when you choose your shutter speed, at least if you want to have sharp images. Because when you have, like here, a tele lens with a large focal length, you need to have a shorter shutter speed. Because the every time you have motion in your camera, the larger focal length, the bigger the movement will be in the picture when you have a long lens, even though when you just shutter a little bit, while with a wide angle lens, the motion is much smaller. So I took here some examples. If you have a 50mm lens, you should always double the focal length here behind the divider, so that if you have a 50mm lens, you should have a shutter speed at least 100th of a sec, or 200mm lens, 400th of a sec. There are some things that might make us change these rules, and these are things we are going to discuss later on. There's also technical things like IBIS. I'm getting further into that later on. But for a start, this is a good rule of thumb. Double the focal length and you know what shutter speed you at least should have in order to be sure to have sharp pictures. For example, if you're doing wedding or something, it's always a good idea to follow that rule. I know from bad experience. Hurtful, terrible. It was so embarrassing. I'm really sorry. Well, a little about technology. Or a bit more about technology. When we talk about shutters, we should also know about the technology behind the shutters. In the good old days when the first Leicas were created, they were all with leaf shutters. that is the first shutter technology, or the very first was a lens with a glass plate behind the lens and a lens hood that you removed and then you counted and then you put on the lens hood again, and then that was your shutter. Um, that was in the very good old days. Then when the Germans and probably also the Japanese, when they invented the more mobile cameras, very well known are the Leicas. Um, they had this shuttle leaf, which is like um, kind of feather driven system where you have these triangles which are like pulled into the middle by a feather, and when you then release it, it just like removes back and then back again in different speeds. It's the great advantage with this kind of shutter is that the leaf shutter is that it's very silent, and you don't have to consider anything about uh, when you do flash photography, synchronization, anything. You can have the fastest shutters and don't have to have need high speed sync in your on your flash and so on. So for this is very beautiful, and it's silent. Um, I've taken an example of a camera that uses a leaf shutter. Um, I've got one myself. It's a Ricoh GR3 or GR. They all have it, and it's beautiful to work with because it is so silent, and you just kind of work stealthy. At the same time, you create great quality. The other great thing about the leaf shutter is that there are no vibrations, so you don't have when you, for example, when you are on a tripod or something, the not so good mechanical shutters are can be vibrating a little bit. You don't have that with the shutter speed because also this it's very symmetric. So if there should be any vibration, it moves, it levels out each other, so to speak. The other here is the curtain shutter, or also called the mechanical shutter, which is where you have a kind of curtain running, opening up and then running up and down here, just like a pulling curtain, and um, the distance between these two curtains decides the shutter speed, so to speak. Uh, it's almost the same with the electronic shutter. Sorry for spelling. Um, um, but there it's just the closing which is going with the curtain. Here's another example of a camera with a curtain shutter. This is a typical DSLRs, but also the good uh, mirrorless system cameras. They all have these kind of shutters, um, and they are very fast. They are very versatile. The electronic shutter there is a little um, um, with some, what's it called, blur or something. There is a bit of noise in the pictures, especially in the shadows. So you can use it in highlights, especially when you need very fast speeds. It's very good. But be careful with using it within the shadows. But you can learn a lot more about that by seeing or reading reviews about cameras with these kinds of shutters. The last thing about the cameras I wanted to say, and that was what I said was the exception from the rule with this uh, focal length versus shutter speed. It's the image stabilization, or also IBIS, where you have like the sensor. Um, mounted in a kind of, what could we call it, gimbal that makes all the shakings and so from our hands, which we might have, which levels them out, and thus we can have much longer shutter speeds and still have sharp images than we could before. It's a great technology, and this gives us the opportunity also to having, for example, images where the environment is tack sharp, but where people or animals or whatever is move around this environment. Um, I think I have some examples later on which I can show you about this. A little more about the tools. When we work with shutter speeds, especially long exposure, when we have shutter speeds longer than what the lenses wants us to have, then we need some kind of stabilization tools, and the most well-known is of course the tripod. But that's the classic. Today we often use monopods, which with the IBIS gives us some stabilization. Not, of course, not as much as the tripod, but we can take longer exposures than we could before. I've also included these pictures with a little pillow or just a wall, where you can, if you don't have a tripod close to you, you can take anything that doesn't move easily and just place your camera on it or lean against it or do what you do, and thus get some stabilization tripod wise. And thus you will be able to take longer exposures and still make them good. My tip or my trick when we work with this, and I do this very often, is to have your setting on so that you take more than one picture when you press your shutter, because then if you take picture, 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 and you just have your shutter down, you won't have the movement from your finger or the shaking from your finger. You won't have that in. So take 4, 5, 6 pictures. Many will probably be unsharp, moving, but maybe or probably one of them will be good. That's one way to do it. Other tools which I'm going to discuss further, but which also are relevant here, is especially if we want to take long exposure photographies, pictures, is the neutral density filter, or ND filters, just like, which you can buy in many different darknesses, and you define them by how many stops you have to stop down on your speed or your aperture. So how big difference there is from the light outside and what you do through the filter. Because when it is a very bright day, you probably will, and if you want to, for example, have a shallow depth of field, then you must put your ISO down to very low numbers, and you will have to do shutter speeds into very high speeds, and thus you are fixed. But by using a neutral density filter, you can regain the creative possibilities. For example, you make your picture very much dark, then you can have longer exposures and still shallow depth of field. So there you can change the rules you in the light or exposure triangle you're working with. And I will show you examples. Other tools which we will discuss here is just something like a torchlight, which we can use also for creative photography with long shutter speeds, but I will get back to this. There's also tools for short shutter speed. For example, this Pluto, yeah, I call it a speed photography trigger, which is, for example, for water drops, we're getting back to that, where it likes gets triggered by some movement. You can get tools for this, and this is important, for example, also if you want to do high-speed photography of bullets or exploding balloons or things which are very, very fast and where it's very important that you nail the moment where it happens. But I will get back to this later on. So that was the technical part. Let's look a little on what the shutter speed does, or what happens when we have different shutter speeds. And here is a very neat little example. When you have a fast shutter speed, you freeze everything. Yeah, basically, I mean, you can probably do a calculation how many centimeters or inches per second does a thing move, and then you can put this over time, and thus you can like see how short time does it take to freeze something. I don't have this specific calculation, but I'm sure somebody has done it. And then you can like, if you make the shutter speed longer, well, then you can create this blurry um, um, effects. And as you can see here, this photo or these three examples, you don't have to do super long shutter speeds. You can have semi-long, and then you will already get this blurry effect. And here with the left, it has a longer, but I can assure you if you would have made the shutter speed like, this is probably 2 or 3 seconds, maybe even shorter, but if you made it 10 seconds, it would look even different from this example. Yeah, good. Now I'm take a little sip. And then I'm going to look at, we are going to look at lots of pictures where we have examples of creative use of shutter speeds. And we start here in New York, where you have this example of it's probably tripod, or there is a staircase on this side where the photographer is standing as well. So he's standing high, he's positioned high, and he might have used a tripod, or she, but could also just again put the camera on a stable surface and then take a picture, and then with a long shutter speed, as we can see in this picture, it is kind of sharp from edge to edge, so it is stepped quite a lot down aperture wise, so it's a very small aperture, which has created a big depth of field, and but we can see that the shutter time has been long because these guys, they are standing still, therefore they are pretty sharp. But we have these shadows here, which are people who are walking through the hallway, and it creates a very special effect, this blurry effect. It's very, I think it's pretty beautiful. Another way you can see that it is with a very small aperture is actually here on the lightning stars, because you can only get the starry light effect by closing your aperture pretty much down. So this is one way to use this effect. You could also like have make a portrait or something of a person standing here, concentrating on not moving, and then everybody else moves, and this way you could also like create this difference between all the moving people and this one person standing still, and thus create a very beautiful effect. And of course, we will always thrive to get it as sharp as possible, but sometimes I think the story maybe will be even better than the technical. The question is it technically perfect? But that's a discussion we photographers we always have. Here is another example actually of this still standing person where the rest is moving. Where you can see this effect, and it makes it really stand out. It's a composition technique that is actually quite effectful. Just to take it up where I left it last week about composition. Here's an example of what happens when you use a very short shutter speed. We know by experience that these rotors, they move very, very fast. So we can freeze them with a short shutter speed. These move even faster, and they are almost frozen as well. And it creates this effect that you almost feel that this helicopter is falling. Then we have here another one where we have definitely longer shutter speed. We have this where the rotors look very different. But we have also another effect, because just to demonstrate, the photographer must have been following the chopper with the camera in order to create this blurry effect in the background. So we and this is also an effect also which we see with speed cars and fast moving things that we just like move with, and thus create this blurry background and a sharp foreground. And you can see if you look at the edges here, you can see it's not tack sharp, but who cares, because against the rest it still stands quite nice and sharp. Then I just brought another example from the other night where or yesterday evening, where I was in the Tivoli Garden in Copenhagen. We have what's it called? A kind of carousel in Tivoli, where you where you are flying just like on a windmill. Very fast. Actually, it's like the same stuff pilots use to test if they can handle high G numbers, the force against your body. And here, as you can see here, you can actually see what they are flying in. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to make this video. So now I'm stepping down and making it slower, and then you get this effect. And this was taken with a monopod. And with the camera, my camera, which has image stabilization, it is possible to you can see there's no difference in sharpness between these two pictures, but there is definitely half a second difference in aperture. You can see the only difference in sharpness is the depth of field, where we have the background sharper here than here. Well, another place to work or to take photographs is in nature, landscapes, and especially when we get to the coast, we can create some amazing effects by long exposure photography. Anton Golin here, who has his own website and where he tells about how he works with photography, he created this example where he took two pictures. This is with a 400th of a second, and this is with a quarter of a second. And as you can see here, you have you really have the movement. You can see everything in the waves, and here you have a more blurry surface, and you can, I mean, there are these landscapes, photographs from coasts where it almost looks like a soup, a blurry soup, uh, and it's just a matter of how long exposure you want to do, and you can create these amazing effects with this. Here's another example where you can create an amazing effect with long exposure. I think maybe she also zoomed a little. No, it must be long exposure because the 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 landscape is not moving. It's sharp, so those are the skies which are moving, and it creates a very great extra effect to this um, sunset, which is already beautiful. Um, here are some more examples, and I'm actually trying to go here to. Well, um, here's the EHS art, which has experimented beautifully with long shutter speeds. As you can see here, water coming very creamy. Uh, the dog. It creates a very beautiful special effect. You never really know what you get uh, by giving long shutter speeds. This is definitely one of my favorites. Here you have this very creamy coastline, the stars where you have very long, and it looks as if she has been um, illuminating the front with red. Hard to say. Here you have this again contrast between sitting still and the movement in the background. Uh, yeah, as you can see, she enjoyed playing with these effects. Um, um, as you also can see here, here's her website address if you like to go through some of her stuff yourself. Um, I would recommend it. But the web is fortunately full of great work and very low shutter speeds. Via Heidi, Miss Heidi, you can write to me and get the source if you like. Good. Let's speed up um, the shutter for a second, or should we say a split second. Um, this is also landscape photography, but with a high speed where we freeze every drop uh, um, in the water coming up and creating a very different effect. Again, for the slow, putting I don't really know how she did this. I'm a little curious if this is star photography or if it is light painting, but it looks like star photography. If you just have the exposure long enough, then the stars are going to rotate in your picture. And thus you can also see that the world is rotating. Um, and when you have the exposure long enough, then also the landscape starts getting colors. Let's make it short again. When you have very short exposures, then you can freeze things. The bullet in the glass bowl, the bullet going through the drop, exploding the balloon. Nice effects, isn't it? And here the drop, created with probably some colored waters, maybe some gels on the flashes, and with this high-speed trigger I was talking about earlier on. Here's some, or I have brought an example of this installation you need to do in order to make these kinds of photography with high speed, syncable speed lights, a macro lens. In this example, it's 100 millimeters, so you really get close to the drop. And here it's a drop kit, and look, they also have this glass plate here in order to create this beautiful reflection in the background. And yeah, this is a place where you play a lot, and you can buy special drop kits if you like to play a lot with these things. Every time you see something interesting and say, oh, this could be fun to learn, I would like to do this. Here in Denmark, I would always suggest my students, well, we have some LinkedIn learning program which the students can use. Sometimes that can help, but YouTube is an extraordinarily great resource to find out at least the basic techniques about these things. Here at the end, I'd like to talk about a little about light painting, and that's also something you can combine with other long exposure techniques. For example, if you do starlight photography, where you have these extreme long exposures and where you combine it with, for example, some landscape or a nice house or something, then when you will expose for at least, or probably 30 seconds if you don't want the stars to move too much. And then while you expose for those 30 seconds, you can go in the landscape and lighten up stuff, and thus create some very beautiful effects. But you can also use your flashlight, your torch, to paint with it. If you have a long enough exposure, then you can, just by making the movements, you can paint different figures, anything, to create some beautiful light painting effects. This picture here, you could see they have combined, probably started with illuminating her face and her front, and then started to paint these angel wings on the back side. As you can see, she has struggled to stand quite still during the time she's been illuminated, so it's a little blurry, but the effect is so beautiful that we live with that. Yes, this is where I normally would take questions. I hope we can find the time to take questions at the next lecture next week, where also we'll be talking a lot of light, but studio lighting. One of the things I find most fun and interesting about photography, and where we start going from where you as photographers can really move away from those who are just taking snapshots to making real professional stuff. I have always my off-camera flashes with me, and I'm using them indoors, outdoors, wherever I am, in order to create the best possible light for my motifs. But that will be next time. I look very forward to it. And from Christmassy Copenhagen, or suburbs in Copenhagen, where we today just learned that everything will be closed down, restaurants, everything, due to COVID-19. I wish you a nice week, and have a lot of fun with your camera. I hope you will make some beautiful stuff, and maybe you can show me some next week. That would be nice. Otherwise, you can always send something to me. See you in a week. Goodbye.